Hello and welcome to episode 32 of the TRUUMAN Podcast, the podcast designed to create a generation of self-defined men. Today, I'm joined by James Gairdner. James, thank you so much for being with me. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, thanks. Beautiful day outside. Shame to be doing this inside, but there you go.
It's the beauties of technology. Unfortunately, we're
Yeah,
not
correct.
in this. But I'll start the podcast as I always do. In your own words, James, what makes you a man?
I guess simplistically, biology. And I guess when I think about that, that's probably the only thing I think that's a defining quality. I think there are probably then more subtle, socially constructed norms that I would play. So I'm a father, and therefore that is usually a male role. Um, we try in our family not to adopt stereotypical roles, but we probably have, in the sense that my wife, particularly early in our children's life, did the majority of the caring, and I worked. And that was certainly the case for 14 years. And actually, that's been quite an interesting shift as she's gone back to work. And then, I played all the traditional sport that you would associate with men. I'm fiercely competitive, which you think I would typically associate with men. So, gender, I guess, orientation to the world, and the roles I've taken up would, I guess, characterize me as a man.
A lovely answer, James. I like the pause at the beginning. It's still my favourite question, just for that pause.
Yeah, it would have been
It's
nice to have some warning, but there you
yeah,
go.
you're not alone in the pausing. Don't worry. So
Good.
yeah, lovely answer. Really nice, really succinct, and really thought out. So appreciate that. Why don't you tell everyone a little bit about what it is that you do right now?
So I'm a director of a company called Heresy Consulting. And Heresy Consulting is a clinically informed leadership organizational development consulting business. And I have a particular interest and focus on high growth scale up businesses. So typically not startups, more Series A funded businesses. So generally north of 100 people and revenue of typically more than 10 million. And I support founders and their leadership teams essentially make that really tricky transition between startup and scale up. And I'm less interested in strategy, although I can do that. I'm more interested in the human challenges of making that transition. So for the founder, how do I stay same while I do a really difficult thing that actually not that many people get to do? And as a leadership group, what does that mean for us? How we need to work together, and actually more broadly at an organizational level, what does that mean? And then we tip into talent management. So, once everything is aligned, then there's a question of have we got the right people? And so that's about the assessment of leadership capability. It's about and then development of that talent, both for the current business challenges, but also, and probably more importantly, future challenges, because as businesses grow, they only increase in complexity, and that requires a different level of capability, which needs developing.
Yeah, I imagine those sort of founders. Is there a lot of friction there? Is like they've gone from their dream to a business, and it's almost that change. Is there anything there?
I mean, most of the stuff that we work with, and most of the individual who's come to us, typically tell a story that says, I used to run this thing and it was really fun to run. It was everything I hoped it would be and more. I've actually been really surprised by my success, but I am successful. The business was successful. And for some unexplained reason, I now find myself, with the experience of wading through treacle, and all the decisions that seemed easy are now hard. And typically, it involves all of these people, and these people won't do what I want them to do. And actually, they won't take any level of accountability, and therefore I'm the only one who feels responsible for this thing, and it's getting bigger, and therefore that weight is only increasing, and I don't know what to do about it. That's typically how people present, and so friction definitely occurs in the organization, definitely, because feeling that way, it's not unusual for us to project that stuff onto other people and to see our faults in others. That's just a normal psychological process. But I think for the individual, it's really challenging, and quite a significant percentage, I would imagine, don't figure out how to deal with this and step away. And for some, that means they exit with decent amounts of money, and for some, it means they leave slightly disillusioned about the idea that it's in some way generative to build a business. So, I mean, for me, it's a really interesting space, and in many ways parallels the experience I have in trying to scale, Heresy, because Heresy is itself a scale-up business, and we ourselves have experienced, that moment of moving from startup to scale up and all of the things that entails. And the challenge, of course, of experiencing that in your own business is that whilst you can be very objective about everyone else, when you're in this shit, it's really hard to figure that out. And I guess what that gives me is a lived experience of what people are talking to me about, but also a real sense of empathy and a patience, actually, because there's an awful lot of people out there who will sell you a quick fix. And the truth is that most of the work that is being done is both organizational work, but it also requires significant personal investment and development. And I think this is very relevant for your work. There's a point, a strong connection often between an individual whose business is transitioning and an individual who is going through their own life stage transition. Typically, the ages that I'm working with people, midlife, which is probably, well, certainly in adult life, is the most significant transition that we'll work through. So disentangling all of that nonsense is interesting and challenging and keeps me gainfully employed.
For me, it's a really interesting space because you touched on it yourself. It's like your business is going through it yourself, and like that's sort of where I start to see businesses that I've done in the past, maybe where some of them I've sort of failed because I've not allowed that conversation to be had. So what I wanted to sort of touch on is, how did you get into this?
How did I get into this? I mean, I could go right back to my early life, in the sense that the reason I'm doing the work I'm doing now is probably twofold. One is because of my upbringing, and nothing particularly nefarious. I mean, I went to boarding school when I was 8, and every time I speak to a therapist, they zero in on that because, I mean, it was formative. Generally, they zero in a negative sense, and there definitely are strong personality traits that are not altogether helpful. The reason I mention that is because what it made me very early on was hypersensitive to context. Because in those environments where you don't have, your parents around or anyone particularly familiar initially, you've got to pretty quickly figure out how you survive and how you get on and how you form friendship groups and so on and so forth. So that makes you immensely hypersensitive, and it also makes you immensely empathetic. And you build the ability to make sense of context and figure out what's going on quite fast. And if I fast forward to now, that's essentially what I do. I sit with founders, I sit with leadership teams, and through conversation, I help them and me, because it's a collective endeavor, make sense of a really unfamiliar context. That interest in people, I guess, drove my early part of my career. So I worked initially in sales for Coca-Cola, and then I transitioned into consumer marketing. I'd always wanted to work in marketing, but I had no marketing qualifications. I did an English degree. So I was encouraged to go into sales as a basis for them making that transition. And And actually, I really enjoyed sales. I'm competitive, right? So I loved the sale, but it was more the opportunity, particularly in the Coke space, to just sit with, amazing diversity of people and figure out needs and benefits and all that sort of good salesy stuff. And then I spent 3 years in financial services. I joined financial services at almost exactly the same time as the whole banking system collapsed, which had nothing to do with me. I'd only been there for 3 weeks, but I got to be honest, I wasn't that interested in banking. I found it dull in comparison to where I'd come from. What I was fascinated by was how you transition a group of people through what for them felt like an existential crisis. If you'd worked in banking for 20, 30 years, you had a really clear sense of purpose. A lot of that purpose was driven around money and the creation of value for clients and for yourself. And you'd seen your wealth and your clients' wealth significantly diminished in a very, very fast amount of time. And I worked for HBOS. And again, HBOS collapsed and Lloyd's took us over. And I worked through the midst of that merger. So that only fueled my interest, I guess, in the space that I'm now working in, which is why do people do what they do, and how through a process can you help people make sense of context and therefore feel a level of agency to be able to take some level of responsibility or have some confidence to do something in the environment that you find yourself in. So the thread that really runs, I think, through my career is this idea that I've just always been interested in why people do what they do. But I've also always had an interest in business. And, what's curious is my dad is an out and out financier. So he's a accountant by trade and a finance director, or was. And my mum is a psychotherapist. Psychologist, not psychotherapist. And so I've always had those sort of competing tensions, and I find myself now building a business around clinical practice. So that kind of makes sense.
Why people do what they do is a good sentence. I think that
Mm.
that's summed it all up nicely. I guess with the space that you're in, this question probably will be really obvious, but do you think competitive nature and success in business are interlinked? And if so, why?
I th- I think, like anything, it's not an either or. Um, I think some level of competition, some level of ambition, however you define that, I think is really helpful. And most corporate environments are places where you need to push yourself forward. And that needs to be motivated by something, whether that's a competitive nature or a overt sense of purpose or whatever. I think that is important. Um, but then the flip side of that, the sort of dark side of that, is unhelpful and will often derail people. One of the dark sides of competition is that you refuse to work with anyone else, and it's all about you. Um, and very quickly in a corporate environment, and certainly in the space that I operate in, you get to realize that actually that's really unhelpful for everyone around you, and it's actually really unhelpful for you because there's only so many times you can compete with people before they just go, well, you're out for yourself, mate, so best of luck with that. um, all the work that I do, certainly all the groups that I work with, work effectively because they come to recognize that actually, life, work, everything is a collective endeavor. Even actually the formation of identity is a collective endeavor. We can't formulate who we are. We can't actually exist. We don't know we exist except through relationship with other people. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think competition is helpful, but it also can be really unhelpful. I would sort of tend more towards how aware are people of what's going on. So if I said, I wanted to over-index, I wanted people to over-index and myself to over-index in one quality, it would be the capacity that I have to be aware of context, the quality of my consciousness, and also the breadth of my consciousness in any given context. And to come back to your question around competing, my sense is that often competition or overt focus on one particular trait will blind you to aspects of context that are important in moving an agenda forward, moving a business forward, bringing a team together. And so, yes, I think it's helpful, but not in extreme, and certainly not in isolation.
It needs to be a trait, not a personality. Almost is that sort of the gist.
Yeah, well, yeah, but also I think it's a question. I mean, there's a really nice psychometric profile that we use, with all the caveats around psychometric profiles, called Hogan. And Hogan speaks to, there are 3 reports, and the central one is called CHDS, but it basically looks at leadership derailers. And what interests us, Heresy, when we look at those profiles is the extent to which people have spikes, because you don't necessarily want someone that's, completely moderate and has no spikes. You want people who have spikes because those spikes are the things on which they built their career, and those are the things that have them stand out. And for some people, competition, ambition is a significant spike. The question really for the individual is the extent to which you're aware of that and recognize that on occasions that can be overplayed, and understand the implications of that being overplayed. But then this is where the role of consciousness comes in, because if you're not aware of that and you just go through life blindly competing with everybody and then wondering why you're unable to build any sort of relationship with anyone, that self-evidently can be problematic.
Yeah, it's being self-aware, I kind of agree with what you're saying. It's like I agree that being competitive and driven is important, but not at the cost of others and not at the cost of relationships. I think that's
No.
really very well, for me it's obvious, but maybe not for someone who's hyper competitive, let's say, where it's their only goal. You use the word motivation in that rather than being driven by competition. So, James, what motivates you right now?
Right now, I think it's about doing good work. And good work to me feels like work that is grounded in solid theory. So, all of the work that I do is based on both experience, which I think is valid, but also a lot of the training that I've done, particularly in the last 5 years, I guess, as I've moved into this clinical space. Just completed a master's at the Tavistock. So in a sense, I know what I'm doing, and I use what I know to make sense of what I see. And that has always been really important to me. So I think doing good work, and then that work being relevant to the particular context that we are finding. So I posted yesterday actually about an event I went to on Monday, which is called a fuck up night, which is amazing, where people come and they talk about their businesses that have failed, which I think there should be more of. And one thing that really came out of that process was there were service providers charging these people who had very, very small businesses significant amounts for what they were experiencing at that time as a panacea. And even a cursory glance at the numbers would have told you that these people could not afford what individuals were offering them. And yet those service providers charge what they charge. And, there's always two sides to every story, but that's never sat well with me. So, I want to feel that the work I do is well grounded. I want to feel that it's the right work. And I want to feel that it makes a difference to the individuals or teams that I work with. So that is a very, very strong motivator for me. In terms of the work itself, I have always been more minded towards the diagnostic end, i.e., how do we make sense of this place? How do we make sense of, in branded worlds, it was how do we make sense of a client's relationship with our brand or with the context in which that brand is consumed. So I was on sports and energy. What's their relationship with sport, for example? In the business world, it's client comes and says this doesn't make any sense. And that's the place you start. And so I'm motivated by co-creating with them a picture that creates meaning through a conversation. I'm less motivated then by and so what would this mean? And this is why working in a business like Heresy is so powerful, because there are people in the organization who are probably better placed than me actually to do the more detailed talent work, leadership development work, consulting work. My really happy place is when I'm sat in a context that to me and to the client makes absolutely no sense at all, and using what I know and the conversations that we're able to have to increase our level of understanding, build a model, that a hypothesis based thing, because you can never be sure, but a hypothesis that enables somebody to do something. So yeah, that's what I'm. And I guess the other thing I'd say about that is, invariably and inconveniently from a business standpoint, often awareness is all that you need. Like, if you're able to increase your level of consciousness, often the solution to your problem becomes obvious. And most of the clients that I work with, I'd say all the clients, are incredibly capable people. And once you have a picture that makes sense, then they are just imbued with confidence to do stuff. So actually, there are many occasions where they just don't need you anymore. And commercially, that's rubbish. But from my perspective, I think that's perfect, because I don't want to build up collusive relationships. I don't want to, in many ways, denigrate other people's agency. Quite the opposite, actually.
It's a nice way of doing it, though. I think there's a PT out there called James Smith. I don't know if you stumbled across him. He said basically, you should be getting rid of me. You shouldn't need me forever. You should use me for a period of time, and then I'm not needed anymore. If I've done my job well, you shouldn't need me anymore. Having that dependence on a service as a business is probably the same. It's like, if you're constantly doing it, then why are you doing it? How is it helping? And those sort of thought processes. So
I mean, if you're in the business of individual development, if you're in the business of personal development, of states making, of really building agency in other individuals, then I would completely agree with that. If you're in the business of providing accountancy services, then clearly, there's probably a need for accountancy services, and or HR services, or whatever. But it's amazing the number of people that would agree with the sentiment, but when faced with the commercial dilemma, will seem to operate in a different way, because collusion with that, continue to build a long-term relationship with the client, is incredibly seductive. Particularly where you start to put money on the table, and I would imagine, particularly at the moment, given the economic circumstances we find ourselves in, given the dearth of coaching and consulting on offer in the marketplace, it is very tempting when you are in a client relationship to want to find a way to perpetuate that relationship.
You see it across the board. I see it. There's a dating called Hinge that its tagline is "made to be deleted," but its business model is a subscription.
No, that's funny. We could go into, so there's a really interesting psychology around that, about what you say your task is, and what your behavior suggests, your phenomenology says about the thing that you're engaged in, and why that might be. So they would be a lovely company to work for.
Well, I think they're scaling, so reach out.
No, good. Yeah, no, I will.
Yeah. So one of the things that you talk about a lot is consciousness and self-awareness, and sort of connecting with that. Can you go into a little bit more detail of that so people could maybe get a bit of an understanding of what you actually mean by it?
At the simplest level, what I basically mean is the level to which you are aware of what is going on around you, the level to which you're paying attention to what's out there versus what's what's going on for you. And the best manifestation of, if you just sit on a train and you watch people, the majority of people on that train are engaged in activities which generally focus on their phone or on the computer. You don't see a lot of people sat on trains. You don't see a lot of people in offices or anywhere, actually, just sitting and engaging with the environment that they're in. And that then is mirrored in the way that people exist in life and in business and in family and so on and so forth. So for me, it's the extent to which you are able to metaphorically stand back, sometimes do stand back, reflect, but actually take a moment to just ask yourself the question, what's really going on here? And I guess, I would suggest, of course I would, because, I'm clinically informed, that some of what's going on here is happening below the surface, below the level of consciousness. So I would make a distinction between what is conscious, manifest, I can see it physically, it exists in front of me, and what is unconscious and latent, and about which ultimately we will never know the truth of what sits in the unconscious, because if we did, it wouldn't be unconscious. But we can build hypotheses based on what we're seeing. So your organization who say we want to do this thing and have a subscription, we might infer from that there's something interesting going on below the surface in that organization, and build some hypotheses about what that might be. And then what we might do is think about what would be the implications of those hypotheses. How might that play out? So when I talk about consciousness, what I'm basically inviting people to do is ask themselves that question, which is what's really going on here? And think about that from a conscious perspective. So in an organization, I'd be looking at roles, structure, systems and power and authority, decision-making, scorecards, blah, 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 all that strategy, all that sort of stuff. But then what I'd also be thinking about is what is some of the psychodynamics, the dynamics of the psyche, what's going on below the surface of this organization that might explain the way that this organization has been constructed. And there's an interesting parallel there again with founders and organizations, because invariably what you'll discover is that the psychology of the founder is mirrored in the organization. And unless the founder and all the individuals who run the organization are aware of themselves, what they won't recognize is how that is showing up in the organization and causing both the reason why that organization is successful, but also the reason why that organization is potentially unsuccessful, dysfunctional. So I guess when I talk about consciousness, what I'm inviting people to do is to take that step back in reality or metaphorically and ask themselves, what's really going on here? And I guess, the advantage that I have with the training that I've had is I have a series of frames that enable me to make sense of that. And hopefully, and this is the big challenge always for me, is find a way to communicate that in a way that doesn't sound mental or obtuse or annoyingly theoretical and academic. And actually, I don't even think you need that. If you can sit in a coffee shop off your phone and just observe the people around you, and construct hypotheses, stories, narratives about who are they, what they're about, what they're up to, why they just spoke to the barista in the way that they spoke to them, how they articulate that name and what that means, how that means they feel about themselves and their name and their relationship with other people. I I find this stuff fascinating. A bit weird, maybe a bit voyeuristic, but I think it builds a capacity to understand a little bit more than I might do if all I was doing is staring at my phone. And anyone can do this. I guess the only other thing I'd add to that is, the language in the unconscious is is emotion. It's a bit more complex than that, but is essentially emotion. And so many of us are very unaware of how we really feel. And so developing the capacity to just check in with yourself and ask yourself, how am I feeling in this moment? And also ask yourself, are those my emotions, driven by the parts of myself that I know reasonably well, or might that tell me something about the individual I'm interacting with, or the environment that I find myself in? There's a lot more data in the world than we pay attention to, and a lot of the problems that I think we experience are because of the paucity of data that we use to try and solve the problems. We're just in this loop. So, yeah, I mean, that's when I think about consciousness, I think about awareness. The other reason why it's important is because in order to create psychological health, we all need to feel that we are in a trusted relationship with another. So we need to feel seen and understood. And therefore, awareness of the other and demonstrating at least a willingness to try and understand them is critical to building psychological health in another. So, as a leadership development consultant, really all we're doing, and certainly this is true of Heresy, all we're trying to really do is to get people to be more aware. Because if you're more aware and you're interested in being aware, it's amazing the impact that can have on the people who work for you.
It's a really complex topic and something that I imagine we can go really deep into, but you've also summarized it quite simplistically, which makes it usable and people can sort of digest, which is good.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, there's I could sort of give you a bibliography of all the things people might like to engage in.
I imagine we could talk for hours on it. One thing that I want to touch on is earlier on you mentioned about sort of like a change in something. So whether that's, let's call it a midlife crisis, or maybe in sort of examples for yourself, it's a growing business, or they may have raised Series A or beyond, and that's sort of like a big point in their life or their career. Do you think people and businesses should be looking at this earlier rather than waiting for these sort of big landmark events to happen?
Yes, as a general rule. I think that's particularly true of the stuff that takes time. So developing an individual's capacity to deal with a greater level of complexity, or a group of people's capacity to deal with a greater level of complexity, I don't think you can start early enough. And most of the challenges that I experience in scaling organizations is the lack of the capacity of leadership to deal with the necessary increases in complexity that organizations bring. Variously, you find people trying to slow the organization down just at the point they want to accelerate in order to create a set of in order to have time actually to process everything that's going on around them. So I think talent management, talent development, talent assessment is woefully underinvested in and is often left too late. Now, there's a reality in that, which is, in a startup business, it's all hands to the pump. It's about, dealing with the sense of existential crisis, and frankly, most of their time needs to be invested in making sure the business survives. Arriving at product market fit, and then basically selling the ass off the thing that you're trying to breathe life into. But I still think that being said, organizations get to this point in a moment of crisis, i.e., when they find the organization slowing down and procrastination and blah, blah, blah. And so, yeah, definitely, we can always do that early. That said, there are things that you just cannot preempt. And indeed, if you think about midlife transition, and again, James Hollis talks about this a lot. He talks about the privilege of suffering enough, which is that all of us needs to suffer to some degree in order to create the impetus to shift. And actually, until we're at a point where we've suffered enough, we won't shift, because we're really good at being who we are up to that point. And therefore, even if we are suffering, what we'll typically do is just repeat patterns, but repeat them harder and faster and more consistently, until such point as we realize actually they're not working for us. And there's a real strong parallel, because they're all human beings, between that experience, the midlife experience, which I myself have experienced, and people who are growing business. But you do at some point get to a point where this is, I'm fed up with this, and then it's either a question of walk away or do something different. And I don't think, there's I don't think you can preempt that. There are, the interesting moment for me is often where a leader, a CEO or founder or someone has come to us and said, look, I have this frozen middle issue where, I'm amazing, but all my people are shit. And, and that's really true. But you take that at face value and you go, okay, fine. So we'll work with this group to help them understand what's going on, build some level of agency. But what you do need to know is they will move. And that will invariably be problematic for you, because what that will mean is you will have to do something different. And my experience is that every single person will say, yeah, no, I'm up for that. But when it happens, I'd say 95% of people have at least a moment where they go, oh, I'm not sure I want to go in this direction. Thanks very much. Because, as I say, all of us are really good at being who we are, and those transitions require something fundamentally different from all of us, and we have to give some shit up. So, yeah, the answer to your question is yes. I think we can always think earlier about this stuff, but there's some stuff that we just need to go through, and the suffering is important. And I will say that this is one of my bugbears with people who've done it before, mentoring people who have not done it. Yeah. Because I think whilst there is value, there's definitely value in that. I think you cannot avoid, and part of the learning experience is to go through the slings and arrows of trying to figure it out for yourself. And I'm not sure some of that stuff can be shortcut. We need to suffer in order to grow and build some level of motivation for change, or we just won't.
Yeah, well, it does everything, right? Resilience, motivation for change, lessons, everything that you can sort of go through. I imagine as a father, that's something that you think about with your kids as well. Is like, I can tell them lessons, but I sort of want them to have some mistakes.
Yeah, it's. I knew the guy who really got me into this work, particularly the diagnostic work, a guy called Mac Andrews, who's had a huge impact on my life, particularly at the moment when I was in a significant transition just before my daughter was born. And he basically taught. I remember one thing he said to me, which is that he was very pleased I was having a daughter, because he said she would teach me a lot, and she has actually. Your question goes back to what is it like to be a man. I think my view of that question, my view of what it is to be a father, has been fundamentally changed by her and my relationship with her, but also in my relationship with my son. But it's very interesting in very, very different ways. But yeah, definitely, my kids are. There's always and again, it plays out between me and my wife, because we have very different perspectives on risk. I tend to not think about the risks until I remember one occasion my daughter jumping from in Jersey, where we lived for a while, from one rock to another over it was a dip in the rock. And when I did it too, and I looked down, it basically went straight down into the sea. And it wasn't until after we'd done it that I thought through what might have happened if she'd missed a step and gone down. My wife, on the other hand, would have figured all of that out before it happened, and had her probably not do it, or if she did do it very carefully. And so, I think what that provides the kids with is a really nice balance between, get on with life and don't worry too much about stuff. And I think a very important thing, which is pay attention to stuff that might do you damage. And I hope that they're only passing through a relationship with us. I hope that in as they get older, they're able to make their own mind up about their attitudes to risk and everything else. Parenting is it's impossible to know the right thing to do. And we are, this will make you laugh. When our kids were Gina Ford, if that means anything to you. So she was the sort of a goddess of what was it called? Like routine. So you would put your kids to bed at a certain time, you would wake them up at a certain time, you'd feed them at some, and everyone in our group who knew we were doing this was like, oh my God. But for us, it was perfect. Like we even got home from the hospital and right, what should the child be doing now? She's asleep. She should be asleep. Good, brilliant. So it's, to deal with that sort of unfamiliar circumstances, it worked really well for us. But I'm kind of hoping ultimately they'll figure out their own way of making it work.
Yeah, well, that's the goal, right? You give them enough tools, but try not to wrap them up in cotton wool too much.
There's no rule book. I just think you sort of make it up as you go along, and also know that that great Philip Larkin poem about how your mum and dad fuck you up. I think whatever you do, as human beings, we construct narratives, and some of that stuff is really helpful, and some of that stuff is less helpful, and all of us develop, patterns of relating which have something to do with our childhood and will serve us and will not serve us. So, and I'm sure we've done that to our kids too, no question.
Most definitely. When I sort of started this little journey of my own and sort of questioning things and sort of going through this understanding of masculinity and this side of things, one of the first quotes that I was told was that it's your parents' first time on earth too, which I thought was quite a nice way of saying, just have a thought for that too before you judge.
Well, funny enough, I did tell my daughter once when she was going through a particularly critical period, like everything we did was rubbish, and I said to her, "You do know we're making this up as we go along." And I'm not sure it was entirely helpful because I don't think she'd thought about it up to that point. And then it was like, oh, you really don't know what you're doing, do you? So yeah. Again, I think that's true of life, though, and this brings me back to my thing about awareness, which is the extent to which you're aware of the choices you're making and the implications of those choices. I don't think it makes us any better parents, to be honest, but maybe it does. Maybe it does. It certainly has had us question the approach we've taken to a whole variety of things. So not easy.
I think honesty will serve them well is my take on it anyway. So yeah, James, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I could talk to you for hours. It's been great. If people have enjoyed what they've heard, where can they find you, and where's best to reach out to you?
So I'm on LinkedIn at I think there's only one James Gairdner. So please find me there. And I write a bit on there, but always happy to connect with people and always happy to have conversation. I'm not in the business of just collecting connections for no purpose. I genuinely like to engage in conversations with people. So yeah, that's probably the best place. If they're passing through Linfield in West Sussex, please drop in, particularly on a day like today. And if people cycle, then always up for a ride. But LinkedIn's probably the best place to start with.
Amazing. Thanks for your time, James.
Pleasure. Thank you.